It's a classics compile-ation on NES Works episode 60. This week brings us two games from FCI, or Fuji Sankei Communications International. FCI doesn't publish video games these days, but it was originally established by Japanese television giant Fuji TV to serve as that corporation's international video game publishing arm. In Japan, Fuji had already been publishing games under the Pony Canyon label, which is probably better known among anime enthusiasts as the company's music label. As one of the more successful non-endemic companies to have raked in huge gobs of yen during the 1985-86 Famicom boom in Japan, Fuji was understandably eager to get in on the ground floor once the Famicom went international and became the NES. And here we see the first fruits of Fuji's aspirations, with a pair of NES games landing in the US in October 1987, exactly 2 years after the console's tentative American debut. During the NES's lifetime, the FCI label tended to evoke a sense of caution for most Nintendo enthusiasts. It's not that FCI's games were bad usually, more that they just tended to feel strange. They were typically games geared toward Japanese rather than American tastes, and NES kids in the 80s didn't really have the cultural context or critical vocabulary necessary to express what precisely felt so off about FCI releases, just that they seemed a little strange. FCI probably made its biggest impression with its NES conversions of Origin and SSI's popular Dungeons & Dragons games, which had originally been designed for personal computers. These ports rarely resembled the DOS originals on which they were based, invariably taking bold liberties with the source material, again to make them better suited to Japanese tastes, but resulting in some weird cognitive dissonance once they were backported for American audiences. To FCI's credit, they at least started strong in the US market. Zanac and Lunar Pool may not be the best-known 1987 releases for NES, but they're both excellent. And why wouldn't they be? Both come to the NES courtesy of one of the most legendary game developers of the 80s and 90s, a studio known as Compile. These days, Compile's longest-lasting legacy is the Puyo Puyo series, which Sega acquired a while back, and which has steadily been releasing into the US under its own banner after years of missing or bastardized localizations. Most memorably, Puyo stood in as a console war appeasement attempt, as the same essential release was turned into both Kirby's Avalanche for Nintendo Super NES and into Dr. Robotnik's Mean Bean Machine on Sega's Genesis. But Compile was about much more than mere détente. It was about technically astounding action games that pushed the absolute limitations of a platform. And we see that right from the beginning here with Zanac, a top-down shooter that absolutely humbles everything that has come before it on NES. But first, let's look at Lunar Pool, the older of the two games. Originally designed for the PC 8801 home computer in 1985, Lunar Pool was the first game to have been produced under the Compile label. The talent behind the company had been working together since 1982 under the name Programmers 3, and they formally incorporated as Compile right around the time Lunar Pool shipped. Since 1987 was all about doubling up releases on NES, Lunar Pool would be the first of two billiards games to hit the platform this fall, the other being Data East's Side Pocket. And just as happened with Ring King and Punch-Out, Data East's release was a whole lot less impressive than this one. Lunar Pool is, in effect, billiards as science fiction. It features several different play modes, including solo play, head-to-head competition against another player, and a versus CPU option. All modes involve trying to sink numbered balls into pockets lining a green table, while simultaneously trying not to cause your cue ball to fall in and scratch. The control interface is about what you'd expect. You rotate a cursor around the cue ball and try to match the constant flux of a power meter to the force with which you want to strike the ball. Where Lunar Pool differs radically from other billiards video games is in the shape of its tables. There are no less than 60 different tables to tackle here, and each one has its own distinct layout. The first table is standard fare, a rectangle with pockets at the corners and at the midpoints of the longer sides. But from there, they get considerably wilder. Lunar Pool's more complex tables turn this game into something closer to miniature golf, with the difference being that putt-putt usually just had a single hole or two per green. Lunar Pool's tables can contain a dozen pockets, sometimes even more, and each one of them presents a perilous hazard to your vulnerable cue ball. Naturally, the game rewards you for sinking balls sequentially from 1 to 6, but when you take on one of the more intricate tables, you'll be relieved simply to sink all the balls safely and move along. To add to the challenge, Lunar Pool allows you to tweak the friction of the table surface. By default, friction is set to 32, standard resistance, but you can tweak the friction anywhere from 0 to 256. Maxing out resistance results in a game that appears for all intents and purposes to be completely unwinnable. On the other hand, setting friction into the single digits makes for a wild, exciting journey into unpredictability. At 0, the table literally exerts no resistance on the balls, meaning they only stop moving after being struck once they hit a pocket. In order to prevent your cue ball from wandering its way into a pocket and giving you a scratch, you need to master the art of kinetic transference so that the momentum of the cue ball shifts directly into the ball it strikes. However, 0 resistance is actually about as vexing as max resistance. The game won't return control to the player until all balls have ceased motion, so a slippery table inevitably amounts to long sessions of watching the last ball or two slowly wobble their way around the table. Or worse, watching a ball enter a locked state where it reflects back and forth at 90 degrees between parallel surfaces forever. But so long as you avoid these extremes, Lunar Pool is a lot of fun. It clearly is the work of some programmers who wanted to do more with their physics modeling than carom balls around a boring rectangle, and the end result is a dynamic, content-packed pool sim that's every bit as fun to play solo as it is to play competitively. It's admittedly not the most attractive game on NES, but what it lacks in looks it more than makes up for with variety and replayability. Not a shabby start for FCI and Compile on NES. Even more impressively, the same pair also delivers Zanac. We've seen quite a few top-down shooters on NES since 1942 debuted nearly a year prior, but none of those can even begin to compare to Zanac. At first glance, Zanac looks an awful lot like Alpha Mission. It combines a standard weapon with secondary upgrades, denoted by alphanumeric icon pickups, it scrolls bottom to top, and it fills the screen with ripples of enemy fighters. It's the fine details that set Zanac apart from its peers. For one thing, Zanac is much faster than previous vertical shooters on NES. According to a 2015 GameSide interview with designer Takayuki Hirono, which was recently translated to English by the excellent Shmuplations, Zanac ended up being the fastest vertical shooter on NES to date simply because it didn't begin life on NES. Compile produced quite a few NES and Famicom games in their day, but the company's heart was really invested in the MSX home computer. They were quite likely the second most prolific developer for the platform after Konami, and many of their most beloved NES games have their roots in the MSX. For example, the brilliant shooter Zelda Hybrid: The Guardian Legend was a sequel to a unique MSX shooter called Gardic. Zanac, too, originally debuted on the MSX. The original MSX hardware is somewhat infamous for its poor graphical scrolling capabilities. Indeed, a huge selling point for the Famicom during the mid-80s was that until Hudson's PC Engine debuted around the same time this episode's games shipped in the US, the Famicom was the only major console on the market to feature hardware-based scrolling support. Because the MSX could only scroll forward in 8-pixel chunks, Hirono's team programmed Zanac to scroll the backgrounds so quickly that those 8-pixel increments would appear to be smooth and seamless. By comparison, Alpha Mission only scrolled 1 pixel every other frame, meaning its backgrounds absolutely crawled along by comparison to the dizzying scenery in Zanac. Ultimately, the illusion of speed in Zanac was strictly that, an illusion. In terms of gameplay, the brisk pace of the scrolling mostly forces players to stay on their toes when it comes to gunning for the ground-based panels that can be cracked open to reveal power-ups. Zanac demands a modest amount of memorization, albeit strictly for the placement of power-up opportunities. Unlike in other shooters of the era, though, Zanac's foes can't really be memorized. Although they move in formations and patterns, Zanac's enemy attacks can't really be predicted, as they vary with each playthrough. This gets to the real selling point of the game. In Japan, Zanac was called Zanac AI, which speaks to its primary innovation, dynamically shifting enemy behavior that takes its cues from the player's performance. As players dodge enemy fire, their assaults increase in frequency. Play aggressively by leaning on the auto-fire, and enemies will send out countermeasures, including assault craft that fire what appear to be solid sheets of missiles in your craft's direction. The better you play, the harder Zanac tries to kick your ass. Would you be surprised to discover this concept was lifted directly from Xevious? As I said last episode, Xevious had a huge impact on Japanese shooter design in the mid-80s, and Zanac underscores that fact. In Xevious, the longer you managed to survive without losing a life, the more advanced the enemy forces became. Only truly skilled players saw the most dangerous enemies in Xevious. Normal players would simply see the basic types, as the game's threat level would reset upon their death. Zanac expands on that concept by making enemy forces far more reactive to the player's performance. For their part, Compile wasn't shy about admitting what the game owed to Namco's classic. The name Zanac is an anagram of Nazca, a reference to the Nazca lines that appear in some of Xevious' zones. Where Zanac differs from Xevious, besides not differentiating between aerial and ground attacks, is in the way its stages are arranged. Zanac typifies Compile's love for incredibly lengthy stage layouts, but unlike in Xevious, you will encounter hard divisions between stages. In fact, Zanac includes a password feature to allow you to record your progress, so you can take another crack at completing the game without having to rehash the opening stages every single time. Given how lengthy and challenging the total game turns out to be, that's a welcome addition. Both the MSX and Famicom Disk System versions of Zanac in Japan had a save function. But as we've seen, not every publisher felt compelled to convert its disk system recording functions to cartridge releases. So props to Compile for making the effort. Despite the sometimes punishing length of Zanac's stages, the speed of the action, and the ferocity of the enemies, the game doesn't feel unfair or unreasonable. For one thing, when your ship is destroyed, you resume your next life immediately where you died, rather than being sent back to the beginning of the current stage. It also helps that the secondary weapons are wildly helpful too. They range in design from high-powered forward beams to a projectile that explodes into a smart bomb on contact to an indestructible shield. Special weapons do have a few downsides though. While they can be powered up to become even more powerful, they also have limited ammunition, and more importantly, relying on special weapons is a sure way to cause enemy aggression levels to rise. Mastering Zanac requires a combination of twitch skill, level layout memorization, and the ability to balance raw firepower with caution in order to prevent the enemy aggression from growing unmanageable. In most shooters of this type, you want to fat finger the fire button the whole time. Zanac, however, encourages a more reserved approach. It's what you might call the thinking man shooter. Not that it's incredibly literate or artful or anything, it's just that the computer is also thinking and needs to be confronted on its own terms. Compile would go on to create some of the finest classic shooters of all time, including Gunnac, the Guardian Legend, and the Aleste series. Eventually, the company splintered apart and shuttered, but its legacy has lived on through offshoot studios like Rising and Milestone. It also gave us Compile Heart, but we don't talk about Compile Heart. Even with that one dark blot on their record, Compile was one of the true greats. And Zanac drew up the template the studio would work from in the coming decade. And this is a solid start for FCI too. It's just a bummer their output wouldn't always be up to the standard. On the next NES Works, Squaresoft returns, so grab those 3D glasses.